we decided that this was an important conversation that in the context of human energy we haven't had with such an intention. And what I am committed to in the world as a business school professor is creating and educating the next cohort of students to be leaders that can make a positive contribution. And what that means is oftentimes enigmatic, possibly. What is a positive contribution? And I think with the concept of the noosphere, we're getting a little bit of more clarity in terms of how that can happen. And I think it's very fascinating that the pathway of Ben as an entrepreneur got us to be together to talk about these concepts that are actually typically far-fetched, very far-fetched in terms of what a typical business student is exposed to and what a typical business practitioner is exposed to. And yet what we find, even with the conversation that we just had with Ilya Delio from the theological perspective, is that there's so much humanity involved in the centrality of love that plays a role, I think, in all of our normal human lives, maybe not our professional lives, but it may be time to reconsider how our professional lives intermesh with our private lives and our ideal lives. And in my journey as a business school academic and professor, I was so happy to connect with all the consilience of knowledge from the theology to the biology to the physics in a way that it does give us answers that are pretty convergent about who we are as human beings and what we want and how we can potentially steer our lives. And I think that noospheric perspective is something that's much needed at this point of time to give hope and direction. And so, without further ado, I'd like to have David Sloan Wilson just share a little bit of his thinking about how business and organizations can play a role in creating a positive noosphere. And then we'll hear from Ben a couple of thoughts about why he's doing this. And then we'll hear from Bob Chapman, who is the CEO of Barry Wehmiller, a manufacturing-based company that is actually a conglomeration of 100 plus companies. And David sees this as an example of cultural evolution in a way that can help us all understand a little bit what can we do as business people, as leaders, and those that want to be part of healing the noosphere and creating a positive atmosphere. And then at the end, we will have Greg give his perspective as a CEO that is actually working with these noospheric thoughts to be very specific in terms of how we can bring people together in more effective ways. So, David?
Great. Well, I want to begin with Terry Deacon's talk, in which he made the point that the noosphere is not a new or future thing, but it exists all around us. It began with the origin of our species, and that a small noosphere is a small group that actually functions like a superorganism. And I think that when we think about that in the context of a business, we could say that a business is functioning as a noospheric unit when it has become a very highly cooperative unit and functions with the harmony and coordination of a superorganism. It has the qualities of love and cooperation and the kind of structure and the anatomy and the physiology. So these ideas, I think, translate right away into business performance. And I think it's quite interesting to note that a lot of the conversation here has been highly abstract, theological, and just seemed far from being practical, but in fact they get practical very, very fast in terms of organizations that function so well that they actually deserve the term organism or superorganism. It has this quality of love that, of course, is so central to Teilhard and seemingly so absent in the business world. And so it truly is a paradigmatic difference from the prevailing paradigm in the business world, which is the neoclassical paradigm, the greed is good paradigm, the shareholder value model. And it can be described in Teilhardian terms or not. And that's another point that I want to make, because often these things actually, although Teilhard was a visionary thinker, sometimes it's possible to describe them even without referencing Teilhard at all, as long as the ideas are in place. So as it turns out, if you actually measure a company and you find the ones that for one reason or another they've embraced these principles and they're truly caring organization, what you find is they work spectacularly. And even in a business sense, they outcompete the competition. And there's no better example than Bob Chapman, who's right here in this, and Barry Webuller, and the over 100 companies that they have not acquired but adopted, as they put it, is a real kind of a proof, along with other companies, the conscious capitalism movement and so on, that this is a good business model. And with that, I will turn it over to our next speaker.
Very briefly, and then
over to you.
Well, I'm delighted to have our two virtual speakers here, or participants. It's just fantastic to see business people finally come into the circle of human energy. I think human energy, when I got it started, my desire initially was to study the concept of the noosphere, and so I spent a lot of time trying to seek people like David Sloan Wilson and Terry Deacon, etc., who are biologists, scientists who study evolution, etc., in order to understand what this concept is before we launched into getting into more of the practical aspects of it. But we're reaching a point now where I feel we need to involve the business community, and this is a great start for us to start thinking about it. Now, I'm not too sure right now that I know how we want to cultivate this kind of a relationship. In fact, I told Michael that I'd like to start a new track. Human energy right now has 4 tracks. One is dissemination of the concept of the noosphere. The other is scientific research to dig deep into the concept. The third is ethics, and the fourth is education. And we're going to be starting one soon with Michael, and that is, we're calling it Know a Business, although I don't know, it's brand new, the business of the noosphere or something like that. And my hope is that the group here would be joining us to try to define what is it? How does business relate to the noosphere, and how does the noosphere relate to business? For me, I'm very much influenced by Teilhard, and in chapter 10 of his book, which is The Future of Man, chapter 10, he describes this organism. It's a noosphere, but he says it's really a biological organism that's enveloping the globe, and it has its physiology and actually its anatomy is made up of systems that are very similar to the human body. And one of the systems is one of the main systems. Of course, the brain is one of the main ones, and he talks about analogy of the brain of the human being to the global brain. But the big one that pertains to what we're talking about in here is really the business world. It's the trade. It's all the trade that's going on throughout the world, and what that it does to nourish the noosphere. It's really the engine that pumps energy into the noosphere. And what better to have than the two people like you here who are joining us to start thinking about how can we get the business world to be more aware of the noosphere, more aware of this new organism that's developing, this new movement. And so this is a great point, especially here today, to start that discussion.
Thank you. Thank you. And without further ado, Bob, I know that you may not know too much about the concept of the noosphere, and Jay, you neither, but this is a starting point where we think you're already practicing what I think this group here is talking about. So maybe just over to you. Share, please, with us your experience as a CEO putting principles in practice that actually make your organization work and maybe are blueprint for the world.
So I want to start by, somebody once told me, tell people what you're going to tell them, and then tell them, and then remind them of what you told them. So I'm going to start with my message. I believe I've been blessed with a vision of a world where everybody matters. A world where leaders embrace the profound privilege of leadership with the skills and courage to care, sending each team member home at night knowing that who they are and what they do matters, and inspiring them, therefore, to treat their families as they have been treated, and creating, if you will, a more caring world. Thus, beginning to heal this, as Tom Friedman said, this poverty of dignity we're experiencing in this world, where people don't feel cared for, they feel used for other people's purposes. So I want to share with you kind of my transformation from management to leadership in the hopes of inspiring you to join us in this movement. I have a very, just as a benchmark, I have a very traditional business education, undergraduate in accounting at Indiana, MBA from Michigan, joined Price Waterhouse in 1968, and joined the family business in 1969. And I thought from my education and the world I experienced, the success was money, power, and position. And it didn't matter how you get it as long as it's legal. And so I was after what we call in our society success. So I applied the skills I learned in my traditional business education to transform this weak $18 million 100-year-old business that I stepped into in 1969 that my dad had invested in, and have created a $3.7 billion global business comprised of over 130 acquisitions around the world. And we've had a 14% a year compound growth in our share price in that period of time, over 25 years, out actually performing the record of Berkshire Hathaway. So my point here is we've actually created human value and economic value in harmony. So for the first 20 years of my career, I deployed my education with my management skills. And the word management, in my opinion, means the manipulation of others for your success. That's the way I was taught, and that's the way I experienced it. And my unique blend of common sense, creativity, and positive attitude to see value where other people didn't allowed me to build a very unique organization that today, as we said, is a combination of 130 acquisitions from China to India to Serbia to Russia to Germany and Italy, America. So a very global company. Then in 1997, so again, prior to this transformation, our business was doing well because I had a good business model shaped by the challenges of 1980. But in 1997, I began to experience a series of revelations that transformed my view of my responsibility as a leader, now of a global organization. And what happened? One of the ones I want to remind you, I'm Episcopalian. I was at church. The mentor was my rector of my church. And one day I got up after a great sermon, and I looked at my wife, Cynthia, and said, Cynthia, Ed has only got us for 1 hour a week. We have people for 40 hours a week. We are 40 times more powerful than the church to give people a life of meaning and purpose. So as I walked out of the church that day, I said to myself, business could be the most powerful force for good in the world if we simply knew how to care for the people we had the privilege of leading. And the third transformation experience, revelation. I was at a wedding, and prior to this wedding, the lens through which I saw the 13,000, 14,000 people that worked for us, they were engineers, accountants, receptionists, hourly workers, union workers. They were functions for my success. I was nice. We had a successful company, but I saw people as functions. At a wedding in around 2000, when I was watching a young man and young lady, a friend of mine's son being married to a precious young lady, I had a revelation during the service, and the lens through which I saw the 13,000 people in our organization was completely changed, because I realized that the 13,000 people that work for us are not engineers, accountants, receptionists, union workers, hourly workers, production workers, labor. They were somebody's precious child that's been placed in our care, and the way I would treat them would profoundly affect their health and their personal life when they went home. So that day, I looked through a totally different lens as a leader when I saw people in our organization, not as functions, but as somebody's precious child. These revelations led me to the belief that I had been blessed with a vision that could heal this poverty of dignity we have in the world. And I didn't want this blessing to die with me. So we started our own university. I knew I couldn't send our people, our leaders, back to a university to learn to care, because I experienced management, not leadership, when I was in universities. I had a management classes, got a management degree, got a job in management, and I thought I was supposed to manage people. So we started our own university, and our team came up with, from a whiteboard, 3 powerful, very powerful classes. One is on empathetic listening, a 3-day class where we learn to listen, to validate the worth of others, not to judge and debate. That is the most powerful class. That's the first one we take. The second is recognition and celebration. How do you let people know in thoughtful, timely, appropriate ways that they matter? And so looking for the goodness in the organization and saying thank you. And then find culture of service, seizing the opportunity to serve others. Those 3 classes evolved in our university, and we started teaching it around the world with the objective of transforming our managers into leaders. The phenomena that I want to make you aware of, when we started teaching those 3 basic classes to people around the world in our organization, they didn't tell us they ran a better sales department. They didn't tell us we were more productive. They didn't tell us we made more profitability. They said their marriage was better and their relationship with their kids was better. It never occurred to me before that day, never, that the way I would run Barry Wehmiller would affect people's marriage and their relationship with their children. And so as a result of this journey, and we didn't really know what we had until a gentleman named Simon Sinek, who's got like 27 million followers, wrote the book, Finding Your Why. He's one of the top TED Talks in the world, Discovering Your Why. He came in and said, and spent 2 days talking to our people and said, I'm no longer a nutty idealist. I've just seen what I dream of. I dream of a world where you could tap anybody in the shoulder in any city and say, do you like your job? And say, no, I don't like my job. I love my job. So Simon said, if it exists, it must be possible. So Simon just happened to meet me, happened to be intrigued by what I said. I didn't really know what we had. And Simon was the first. Simon came in and Simon started inviting people from around the world that he meets in to see this phenomenon. And as a result, I ended up giving a TED Talk with over 250,000 views. I was urged to write a book to share this with the world. Everybody Matters. Apparently a good business book sells 5,000 to 10,000. We just passed 110,000 copies in 7 languages around the world. Harvard, about 7 years ago, wrote a case study on our culture. They told us last fall it is now one of their better selling case studies, with over 70 universities from Japan to India using it to teach leaders how to care. And we created an outreach initiative because we were urged to share this, and we created a Chapman and Co. Leadership Institute where we share this with major corporations who believe what we believe and want to join us in this journey with the law of early adoption to prove it is possible to care and create value. They're not in disharmony, they're in harmony, full harmony. We have over 50 team members now in that. And we created a foundation, a nonprofit, to go around the country into communities. It's called the Chapman Foundation for Caring Communities, to bring these principles of education, of listening, recognition, and celebration, and service to others into communities. And we are now targeting creating caring communities. And last year, and again this year, I've given over 54 speeches around the world to major organizations like Airbus, 1,000 leaders in Saudi Arabia, 600 in China. So my point of all that is the message I'm sharing with you has been validated by the interest in the message through the book, the exceptional book sales, the Harvard case study. I have never had anybody come in and experience our culture by talking to our people and say it doesn't make sense. So I want to share that with you. So we've been on this journey for about 20 years. And I want to leave you with a view of where we are today. It's kind of a reality check right now. Today, the world we are in right now, that many of us are very concerned about. 88% of all people feel they work for an organization that does not care about them. And I mean universities, hospitals, businesses, the government, military, 88%. 74% of all illnesses in this country, because I tell CEOs all the time who are worried about the cost of healthcare, I said, you are the problem. 74% of all illnesses are chronic. The biggest cause of chronic illness is stress, and the biggest cause of stress is work. So basically, as Jeffrey Pfeiffer at Stanford said, wrote a book called Dying for a Paycheck, and he quotes this in that book, and he doesn't mean anxious to get it. He estimates we're killing 120,000 people a year from work-related stress. Raj Sisodia, my co-author who wrote Conscious Capitalism with John Mackey, he told me that there's a 20% increase in heart attacks on Monday mornings when people have to go back to work. And 65% of all people, according to Gallup, would give up a salary increase if they could fire their boss. All of these statistics explain what Tom Friedman calls the poverty of dignity we have in this country. People don't feel valued, they feel used. And when they feel used, they feel humiliated. And when they feel humiliated, you'll see anger and unrest like you've never seen before. And he quotes Nelson Mandela. So what we are seeing in this country right now, in my view, and I embrace what Tom Friedman said in his New York Times article, we have a poverty of dignity more than a poverty of money because people don't feel valued. And so I'm incredibly inspired by the magnitude of which this message has been validated. I feel I've been blessed and a calling to share it and create a movement that will live well beyond my time. The principles of truly human leadership are very simple. It's around people, purpose, and performance. It starts with our fundamental responsibility to the people we have the privilege of leading, around a purpose that inspires them, and then we've got to create value, both human and economic value. And now we're equally focused on elevating. So what I realized when we started going out and helping major organizations learn to care for their people, I said to myself one day, why do we have to fix adults? And I realized the problem is education. I look back on my education, the education of others, my children, and I realized that our education system is about giving the people the skills to have a career, to make income, and have what we define as success. And so we decided, again, that we needed to focus on transforming education. So while we have the Leadership Institute and the Chapman Foundation working to heal the brokenness we see in this country by addressing organizational issues, we are now equally focused on primary education, K through 12. We funded a major program in Charlotte, North Carolina's premier private school to integrate human skills with academic skills. So when children graduate from high school, they're ready to go out and live in society and care for each other. That they've experienced it, they've learned about it, their teachers experienced it. And we are working with universities. We have 5 or 6 universities now ready to help them transform their education program to integrate human skills. As Maya Angelou says, I want to leave with this statement. Maya Angelou says it beautifully. We have done the best we can with what we know. Now that we know better, let's do better. Therefore, going out into the world and healing this poverty of dignity that is the foundational issue, creating the issues that have us all concerned. I want to leave you with this statement. The greatest act of charity is not the checks we write to great charitable organizations. The greatest act of charity is how we treat the people we have the privilege of leading at home, in our communities, and at work. And if we could give people those skills, we could heal many of the issues that concern us all in terms of the future of this country and the world. Thank you for this opportunity, Michael, and I appreciate it.
Thank you, Bob. We have time for one question, and Bob, I don't know if you have time to stay until 3:15 our time here, but is anybody here moved to have one burning question that we can answer.
I have just a comment, really, which I'll make quick, and that is one of our tracks is to develop ethics for the noosphere. And Bob, you just stated them. The new ethics, the existing ethics is all about me and how do I benefit and what's in it for me. The new ethics for the noosphere is what's in it for us and what can I do to benefit all of us rather than just me. I just wanted to point that out.
I have a question. It's a brief question.
Okay.
So what's the role of empathy in your thesis, and what do you think this empathy can change the future of just not the work, but overall globally?
Yeah, I would say that our listening class is called empathetic listening. Not listening with your ears, but listening with your heart. Again, I was astounded when when we decided to create our university, that our team came up with empathy, empathetic listening as a foundational class. And so it is a 3-day intense class where grown men and women are brought to tears because they didn't realize they were hurting the very people they loved because they didn't know how to listen with empathy, not judgment, not listen to debate, but listen to validate the worth of others. And when Bill Urey, some of you may know, Bill Urey is a world peace negotiator at Harvard. He was one of the first people that came in. Simon Sinek said, "You've got to see this, Bill. You got to see it." So Bill spent 2 days in two of our largest operations in America. And Bill had something I want you all to remember. He said, "Bob, in my 2 days here talking to people, I saw the answer to world peace." I said, "Bill, how can you come to a manufacturing company and see the answer to world peace?" He said, "I saw a place where people genuinely care for each other." Okay. And that's the empathy piece. They learn to listen, to understand, to have empathy for others, not judgment and debate. We have a world where we teach people how to speak and we teach people how to debate, but we don't teach people how to listen. That is the void we have in the world that we're working desperately to solve. So empathy is key. And then Bill said, "I now realize I've been going to global peace talks for 30 years. And I now realize that's just what they are. They're global peace talks. The problem we have in the world is we don't know how to listen with empathy." So you've hit the nail on the head. Empathy comes from the ability to listen, to understand, not judge. And one of the biggest things I learned is that we're all born with unique personality types that shape the way we see the world. Two kids in the same family can see the same situation entirely differently because they have a different lens through which they see the same facts. How can we get along with Russians and Chinese and Israelis and Palestinians if we constantly are saying we're right and they're wrong? This is a process of beginning to listen, to understand, to heal this brokenness we feel all over the world, in our communities, in our families, with our races. Until we learn to listen, and we've been doing this for 20 years now, and you all would be in tears if you heard the feedback of people who take this class. So anyway, I would say to you, empathy is the foundation for truly human leadership.
Thank you. We do have a couple of more questions, and we wanted to get Jakub to come on. David, can you ask a question? And Greg, can you ask your question briefly? Then we can get something.
Yeah, I really love the approach, Bob, and it's so important, the way of treating people, listening. I'll have some further comments on that. But I'm wondering if you also have a process in place. You have lots of different companies that you've acquired and brought into your fold of selecting those that you think are really aligned with the needs of the future. And I mean strategically, or aligned with sort of the larger ethos that you're trying to create.
Let me build on that because it's very close to my questions. So often with cultural change, it's hard to get from here to there, and you seem to do that very reliably. Often I think working with companies that are not aligned initially, but following the old model, but you managed to do the cultural transformation. And so I think all of us are eager to hear how you can reliably do that?
We are a global organization of 100 and over 130. I like to call them adoptions. I don't buy and sell my kids. I don't buy and sell companies. I adopt them, and they're part of our family, and people feel safe. I would say to you, the fascinating thing to me is this journey began in America, but I just came back from a European tour from Serbia to Germany to Belgium to France, and it is a universal truth in every organization I've been able to adopt that people simply want to know they matter. Okay, and so I want to make sure I make the point, though. It's not just about being nice. Okay, when Harvard first introduced our case, they introduced it to about 160 global executives. And at the end of the discussion, Jan Rifkin, the professor, said, "Is Barry Wehmiller successful because of its culture or its strategy?" And they voted, and 75% said we were successful because of our culture. And then Jan looked at me and said, "Bob, would you like to comment?" Now, I'd never given an ounce of thought, but I stood in front of these 160 executives and I said, "I understand why you think it's our culture that is our foundation of our success. But let me say to you, the foundation of our success is a good business model. Okay, it's not about getting the right people on the bus. It's about building a safe bus, which is your business model. Okay. And then leaders, your drivers who know where they're going and how to drive that bus safely. And then anybody you invite into that bus is going to be fine." So it's clear. It's, again, a little bit like Ferrari designing the ultimate engine. If you put 85 octane fuel in that Ferrari engine, it'll run, but it won't run to its potential. You put 91 premium octane in, it will perform to its potential. Our business model is the engine that we can give people a sense of safety and security. And the culture is the premium fuel that allows that engine to perform to its potential. So it's an important combination. And again, our responsibility, my primary responsibility to our people, is to give them a grounded sense of hope for the future, to make sure we've designed business models with a foundational performance that will give them a future. We don't have to walk in one day and tell them that, "Sorry, we're going to have to let you go because, our revenue dropped, our EBITDA dropped, et cetera." So Simon Sinek's biggest thing he talks about is we got through the 08, 09 downturn with our business model without letting anybody go, and our share price went up 11%. So our business model is the foundation for our stewardship of our people. You cannot be good to your family if you don't earn a responsible income. We cannot be good to our 13,000 team members unless we are creating value in alignment with our shareholders. And again, people will give you unbelievable gifts when they feel safe and they feel they have a future with you. So I spend all my time making sure people in my care can decide to raise a family, have children, buy a home, because they feel safe in our care. And that gives them a sense of dignity, and they go home and treat their spouse and kids better, and we could heal this. I mean, remember, right now, I want to remind you all, we have the most prosperous economy in the world, and we have the highest level of depression, anxiety, and suicide we've ever had. Why? Because of the poverty of dignity. It's not about money. It's about feeling valued, showing people they matter. And we don't teach people that in business school. And that's why we're working to transform that.
Thank you so much. For being here, I invite you to stay on because the message that we are here from that Jakub will share with us is very much in alignment, and it's coming from a different perspective. So, Jay, are you ready?
I am indeed, and I wanted to thank you for letting me go after Bob, even though it's an impossible act to follow, only because I don't think I would have heard his wonderful talk had I not gone just directly after him. So thanks for that, Bob. You use language. I'm also friendly with Raj Sisodia and Timothy Henry, some of the people I think you helped create conscious capitalism around, and I love the language you use and that they use, and I use some of it myself. I was struck by some of the words in particular that you used, like poverty of dignity, stewardship, empathy, and most importantly, healing, because I'm going to be sharing something today, which is a business model, management innovation, business operating model. I'll describe it in different ways, but I'll try to be concise. But really, this is about healing. And more than anything else, it's about healing the broken relationship between business and people, and healing the broken relationship between business and the planet, but in ways that can be mutually beneficial. And I'll tell you how that works in just a moment. And I want to thank Michael for inviting me to do this as well, because it gives me an opportunity to share what I would have to describe as my vocation. And I don't use that word lightly. Referring back to Bob, who I think was quoting Simon Sinek, he was talking about loving one's job rather than just liking it. When you start to engage your workforce and when you start to be engaged yourself in what your gifting is, what's your greater calling? Many people call it a vocation or your individual purpose. It's extraordinary how you can start to bridge that gap between how you work and how you live. And I would say that this creates a kind of a seamless life. As a great friend of mine, Dr. Steve Garber, kind of coined that phrase. And this is really about what we're all after, I think, is creating that seamless life where we're able to live out our vocation, our purpose, including in what we do in the workplace and beyond. So I'll start with something that was really profound, that was said by, not surprisingly, the wise King Solomon about 3,000 years ago. He said, one may give freely and still his wealth will be increased, and another may keep back more than is right and comes to be in need. That really struck me like a thunderbolt when I realized that those words were very much about the question of the right level of profit for a company. And that happens to be the question that John Mars, when I was working for Mars Incorporated for many years, global iconic food and beverage company known mostly for things like M&Ms and Snickers, but also for many pet foods. It's a family-owned, privately held company. And I worked in the internal think tank of that company for about 14 years, helping the chief economist lead it until we spun out into an independent entity in 2020, still working with Mars. But John Mars, one of the leaders of the Mars family, he asked this great question back at the end of 2006, start of 2007, just as I was joining the company from outside. And he asked his CEO, what's the right level of profit for the company? And this was an amazing question because typically in financial capitalism, which we've been operating on everywhere with all companies, more or less for a little more than 50 years, shareholders don't ask that question. They assume the right level of profit is as much as you can squeeze out of your value chain partners. But being asked that question by an owner, by a shareholder of this massive corporation that influenced so many people, it opened the door for us to work on what we call the economics of mutuality, because John was thinking more expansively than just a shareholder that wanted to maximize his financial returns. He was thinking that there's a optimal level of profit above which you're taking too much. So going back to King Solomon, a man may give freely and still his wealth will be increased, but another may keep back more than is right and comes to be in need. I mean, I think that's a real truism in this, and it was maybe influencing John's question, whether he knew it or not. And when you take more than is your right as a business, you actually create a squeezing effect among your value chain partners who then squeeze one another. And this creates a disequilibrium in the value chain. And ultimately that disadvantages the company, but you never see it coming. And so this idea of there being a right level of profit was really intriguing to us. And we went out and we looked as an internal think tank of the company at the time at all the management literature of the last 50 years of financial capitalism, and we found absolutely nothing that addressed this right level of profit question. So we realized it's not a new question. It's an old question. Actually, it's been around for a very long time, but the last 50 years kind of missed it. So I've spent a lot of time over the years trying to communicate economics of mutuality, not always successfully because it can be complex, but I've tried to do it in 2 sentences sometimes, and it doesn't always do it justice. But I'm going to give you kind of the 2-sentence definition of what I'm talking about today, and then I'm going to elaborate on it to some length. It's really economics of mutuality is really an operating model, a business operating model that drives measurable societal impact, which in turn then delivers superior business performance, even in the short term, amazingly, and that equips companies to create something I guess I'd call mutual or enduring mutual value for the benefit of all stakeholders by addressing the societal problems. So I'll just step back for 1 second and give you a little bit of a provocation, which was a starting point for us in terms of our underlying assumptions of what it is that we do. And the provocation is that the purpose of business, and I'm talking about the purpose of business, is actually not to create profit. That's not its purpose. The purpose of business is to create profitable solutions to the problems of people, place, and planet, not to profit by creating problems for people, place, and planet. So with that understanding, what we're looking at here is us needing a better way to see and do business. And I would propose that economics of mutuality, which I'll share now, really is that. is just that, a better way to see and do business. So this was created inside an internal think tank inside Mars, tested in different Mars business segments, and then taken outside in 2020. Spun out in the height of the COVID period with the blessing of Mars and 5 years of funding to help us get started, because there was an understanding that this was a non-rival good. This was something that would actually benefit everyone, including the company, more by sharing it than by burying it under intellectual property. And so we've had an opportunity to work with about a dozen multinational corporations since we've moved out in 2020, from the banking sector to the technology sector, to the fragrance sector, even to retail companies, and certainly food and beverage industry. And we've partnered with Oxford University for 8 or 9 years on this topic. We actually had an economics mutuality laboratory embedded in the business school there for a number of years as well, to help us develop the teaching curriculum around this as well, in the management theory, because I think one of the biggest problems that businesses face is that you stand where you sit. And if what you learned in business school is Milton Friedman's Chicago School of Business, and that's what is practiced in the company you join, there's not a lot of space for you to start to think more broadly. That maybe there's a more complete form of capitalism that actually expands financial capitalism and the definition of performance beyond one form of capital to all 4 forms of capital that are present in the management literature. Those 4 forms of capital, I would say, are the building blocks of the economics of mutuality, and the other 3 are non-financial in nature, and they're called in the management literature social capital, human capital, and natural capital. And in business, you only manage what you measure, and so there haven't been sort of simple, stable, standardized, scientifically robust metrics out there like there are financial metrics underlying the financial capitalism model. But I look at financial capitalism as a 1.0 incomplete version of capitalism. And actually what we were able to do in the early stages of economics of mutuality and its development was to develop the means to scientifically and robustly simplify and measure social, human, and natural capital with just a small number of metrics, actually. We measure social capital by trust, social cohesiveness, and the capacity to work collectively for the common good. And we've discovered through lots of field work and experimentation that that those 3 variables alone, in understanding what social capital is and how it can work in a community, actually always accounts for about 80% of that social capital space. More than good enough for business to start using it and making decisions. But business hasn't realized this yet. They're slowed to coming to grips with that fact. Human capital, similarly, is about individual well-being in the workplace, and identifying those drivers of well-being within whatever corporate culture you happen to be in is how we kind of measure and arrive at those true drivers of well-being for what we call human capital. And when you understand what really motivates your workforce, when you can start to dig into what their vocation is and start to connect them to the purpose of the company and bring them along in that journey, then you start to get performance benefits, actually, that are not surprising, because this is not rocket science. When you address human capital needs and you grow that intentionally in your corporation, you get talent attraction, talent retention, and optimization of performance, because people that are being more fulfilled in the workplace, where their purpose is being genuinely cultivated, I guess that's probably the right word, that they're going to work harder and better and smarter, and they're going to bring in their friends as candidates, and they're not going to leave. The best and the brightest are not going to attrit from your company nearly as fast, and that has significant value for a corporation. So what I'm not talking about here is philanthropy. I'm talking about how can you do more good at a profit, rather than the kind of other space that's in stakeholder capitalism, which is more internally focused and talks more about how do you do less bad at a cost. And so what we're trying to do with more good at a profit is to actually grow the pie in such a way where initiatives that are measurably impactful and beneficial for society and the planet are actually able to drive superior value creation and performance. So purpose is kind of, after you think about those building blocks, those 4 forms of capital I'll come back to in a moment, purpose is really so critical to what it is we're doing. And purpose is so abused by business. Most corporations use purpose as either as a descriptive statement, we do this so that we can make more money for our shareholders, or even more commonly, they position purpose as a value statement, which is really meant to convince people on the outside that the corporate reputation of the company is robust and it should be exciting to them and they should buy the product. But it's not actionable through strategy. There's a third type of business purpose that we try to work with, And it's called a meaningful challenge, and it's externally focused, and it's really framed in such a way that the business activity is specifically and explicitly solving the problem of somebody else. And that's what a meaningful challenge is. Now, I go back to one of my favorite writers, Clive Staples Lewis from Oxford, more than 100 years ago. He said something fascinating about purpose that I think is really applicable here. He said, purpose is like a light, and you don't turn on a light in a dark room to stare at the light. And when companies are using purpose for their corporate reputation alone, that's kind of trying to get people to stare at a light in a dark room. It's not very meaningful. But what we're trying to do is use the light of the purpose to illuminate the problems that the stakeholders that the business has to collaborate with in that stakeholder ecosystem shaped around this sense of shared purpose. Having the right stakeholders do that is what this is all about. And identifying who those stakeholders are, mapping out an ecosystem around the purpose, not around the company and its profit, which is the traditional way of thinking. You look at most descriptions of business ecosystems, and corporations put themselves at the center and then profit of their shareholders at the center of the center. The stakeholders are almost always the same, and it's about value extraction. How much value can I extract from those stakeholders and bring to the center? That's not what we're talking about here. We're talking about decentering the company initially and putting the company as one of the stakeholders around a sense of shared purpose made actionable by framing it as a meaningful challenge, solving the problem of someone else. So once we decenter that purpose, we use this purpose we center that purpose rather, we use that purpose as the right lens through which to identify the right stakeholders that the company or its business unit needs to collaborate with to actually deliver what it says its purpose is. And then we use something called mobile ethnography, which is not very difficult actually, or time consuming. And what we can do is by doing some mobile ethnographic clinical interviews with the key stakeholders in that ecosystem, we can start to map out who they are and what their pain points are. So getting back to Bob's point about healing, this is about identifying pain points and then creating some corporate interventions to help heal those pain points. And when we surface those pain points, we find out that actually we can use the 4 forms of capital I mentioned earlier as a diagnostic tool to kind of understand the nature of each one of these pain points. Is it a breakdown of trust between 2 key stakeholders? If it is, then trust is about social capital, which means you're probably going to need a social capital initiative or intervention to grow that trust that is missing in the relationship between those stakeholders. And when you can do that in 2 or 3 places in an ecosystem that's filled with different pain points, it's extraordinary how much value can result from that holistically and from a more traditional even performance perspective with top and bottom line. Because what you're doing essentially is that you're removing this frame of reference where everything you're doing is return on investment point to point. And so really you're not interested in your ecosystem of stakeholders except for what they can give you. And what you're doing instead is you're treating your ecosystem of stakeholders like a valuable neighborhood. And your stakeholders are neighbors, and you need them to help you deliver the purpose. And so you want to know what they're suffering from. Is it a human capital problem? Is it a social capital problem, a financial problem, or is it a natural capital problem? And you can design and implement basic interventions to grow those forms of capital to start to create a more healed ecosystem of stakeholders. And guess what? A more healed ecosystem of stakeholders just super outperforms a traditional ecosystem of stakeholders where these problems are left unresolved. So that's kind of how economics of mutuality works at the macro level. I don't have enough time to get into case studies, but I'm happy to provide some case references discussion afterwards if there's questions. But as we start to think about how to reflect this in the financial accounting aspects of the business, we're also doing some work to try to create what is called a mutual P&L. So the P&L being the profit and loss statement of corporations that are really used to manage different business activities. And it's fascinating how financial P&Ls are just that. They're all about your profit and loss, your financial profitability and your financial loss. And it's about your growth and earnings. And it ignores the impact, positively or negatively, you're having on natural capital, on the natural resources, on human capital, on individual well-being, and certainly on the trust and social cohesiveness and the capacity to work collectively for the common good of those communities. So you can actually either create or deplete these non-financial forms of capital, and you could reflect it in a P&L on a second line along with your financial performance. You could start to see what your mutual performance is. And as you start to do that, it's remarkable how managers start to think differently and make different decisions that are more focused on how can we really deliver through our accounting methods and through our performance metrics, how can we really deliver something that truly delivers our purpose as strategy. So again, this is about, I'll just end here really with a couple of thoughts briefly. One is that you can do this, and we have an increasing body of evidence actually that are proof points that show that you can demonstrate in a compelling way that there's a causal relationship between how much you create or deplete of human, social, and natural capital, which is all about the flourishing of individuals and community and nature, and your performance in terms of your top and bottom line. So this essentially can remove the trade-off that's implicit in everything you do that's good as a business for society and the environment. There's this misapprehension that somehow you've got to trade profit to do some good for people and planet. And actually you don't. You actually can have a win-win-win type of a situation. It's really extraordinary. And I've been working on this for almost 17 years. And I never go into work feeling unmotivated as a result of the fact that this is a better way for us to operate. It's really about completing capitalism and healing business to heal the world, which was why we named our first book on this topic. I was a co-author of it in 2017, and that was the title of the book. So the last thing I'll say before I yield now the floor is really about this noosphere, because I have to say, as Michael pointed out rightly, that understanding this concept is still very rudimentary for me, but I've tried to read a bit on it in preparation for this. And I guess the best way that I can connect some of what it is we're doing is through the concept of social capital, because social capital, I think, is so valuable now in this new form of economy that we're in, which is called the knowledge economy or the sharing economy. It's no longer about accumulating as much financial money as you can yourself and then buying what it is that you want. A lot of what people want these days is not necessarily for sale, but you get it through your social networks. You get it through your social capital, through this trust kind of construct that you've got. And so while financial capital is so enormously overvalued in many ways, and it's not underpinned by anything actually of value except our confidence in it, of having real value, social capital is actually becoming more and more valuable in this new form of economy, because people don't want to own everything. They want to access it. They want to access the knowledge that they need for whatever it is they want to do, and then they're happy to give it back or share it. You need social capital as the currency to get that. So social capital, we measure, I mentioned earlier, we measure that through trust, social cohesiveness, and the capacity to work collectively for the common good. So essentially, it's the sum of all connections between conscious beings, I would say. And so there's a similarity, I think, to the noosphere in terms of both being the property of the ensemble, if I could put it that way, to which all individuals contribute. So I guess you could say that social capital, which equals social networks and networking, could allow the noosphere to grow. So again, thank you for your attention and for your time, and again, thank you for letting me listen to Bob before I had a chance to speak.
Thank you, Jay, and thank you for sharing some of the background. I know that there are a number of examples that you work with, so that you've just started an investment fund investing in companies like that to grow that noospheric aspect of it. I want to revert back to the panel just to see what kind of questions you might have, comments, David.
Yeah, I have a global question. That first of all, such wonderful work, and what I find is that there's almost like a telegraph. There's other people that are converged upon the same thing, and I even in my experience, I can probably list a dozen organizations or people that have had the same insight. They're basically barking up the same tree, but there's a degree of isolation among them. So there's I think a Tower of Babel problem, an archipelago problem, many islands with little communication among islands. And do you see this as a problem? And what's the solution so that people who are barking up the same tree can actually learn from each other more than they currently are? Because so at the time being, they're just traveling along, it's like parallel play. And so do you see that as a problem? And do you see any kind of solution to it?
I think I probably have been quoted as saying a lot of the same thing that you just said, actually, in asking this question, because I really find it troubling that there are many organizations now that at least have spent a great deal of time, maybe too much time, on grappling with the why question. So going back to Simon Sinek, the why, the how, and the what. We had the advantage through the economics of mutuality of being shielded for a number of years inside a global multinational corporation that was family owned and privately held and far looking ahead. And so we were able to kind of focus on the how almost from the beginning and put aside the question of why we should be trying to transform business for the common good, because we just took it as an underlying assumption initially when it was still not one. But I find that there's a lot of valuable things that are happening in these other types of organizations that are trying to advance movements around transforming business. I spent a lot of time with conscious capitalism, for example, and certainly with other organizations, and trying to figure out, what it is that they contribute to the mission, and what it is that we contribute that's unique from that, and how can we collaborate so that we can create the means to really walk together in a journey of co-creation. And that's one of the reasons why when we created our organization after spinning out of Mars, we didn't set it up as a traditional profit maximizing kind of business. I mean, that would have been counterproductive in many ways. What we did was we created a hybrid platform, and we did it in Switzerland, where the laws actually encourage this type of an activity. But even the Swiss were surprised the way we constructed this platform, that basically we set up a foundation called the Economics and Mutuality Foundation, a public benefit nonprofit foundation, to focus on advancing the learnings in a very open way through educational partnerships, curriculum building, advocacy, research, and so forth. And this foundation actually owns a management consultancy that has no shareholders because it's owned by the nonprofit foundation. So the management consultancy actually operates as a means through which we can deliver in very practical ways for a fee to corporations the learnings of economics and mutuality. The foundation helps us to partner and identify partners and spread the message. We've now added a second, just to address Michael's point about now getting into the investment business. We've added this last year a second foundation that actually owns a second for-profit. And this whole platform is all based in Switzerland, again, so we can benefit by these laws of the nonprofit owning the for-profit. And the for-profit is a investment company, actually, that is now investing both in the private equity space and acquiring companies that we then can transform the operating models from soup to nuts, because we're the general partners of the companies that we're acquiring, but also in the public equities markets by helping some of these big investment houses now look at how can they create social action funds that can be powered by some of the learnings of economics and mutuality. So again, I'm in violent agreement with your question. Sorry if I took a little long to answer it, but I think it's a really important one, that we're marching in the same direction with many types of organizations, but we're not fully collaborating, and we've got to do that and that's a Noosphere issue, I would think.
Thank you. So there are a couple of questions, I presume, and I'm not sure that we get to all of them, but I want to make sure that we also hear from Gregory Stock, who is one of the intellectual founding fathers of the conceptualization and a businessman. So, Greg, do you have like 2-3 minutes of wisdom that you want to add to this?
Comments that I think I could add. Both Jay and Bob had wonderful remarks about social capital, about how to treat your people with empathy and take care of them. I think one of the things that an additional thought is that when we're thinking about the noosphere, there are massive changes that are occurring. And it's important to step back a little bit and to be thinking about where society is going and where the deeper needs are and where the deeper pains are in society that are going to be magnified, that are things that we have to deal with. And be thinking about not just how we're doing it, but what we're doing at a very deep level strategically. And I'll give some examples would be, for instance, in medicine. And I was in medicine for many years, next generation healthcare, Mount Sinai, and that's 20% of our economy. And basically you're dealing with a medicalization of all sorts of issues. And yet about 50% of what's involved with health has nothing to do with healthcare or medicine. It's about people feeling social isolation, people feeling all shreked out, not getting any sleep, not feeling meaning, not feeling purpose. And yet everybody is focused on the pain points of ill health rather than trying to get down to the underlying things that are going on. And so it's important to think about bringing those expertises and those methodologies to businesses and approaches that can really deal with, for example, issues of the epidemic of loneliness and social isolation. And there are many people who aren't employed. They're students, they're caregivers for their families. There are all of these people who are hurting. And I think coming up with businesses that can do that, one of the things that we're doing is we've come up, I have a business called Socratic Sciences, which is generating small group interactions around questions of value and purpose and meaning, and bringing those people together in ways that create relationships, create intimacy, create connection, to try and get at those fundamental issues of particularly social isolation, which is what we're interested in. And so, I'd be interested in your thoughts about that sort of selection and forging sort of new approaches in realms that aren't nonprofits that are masquerading as businesses, and they aren't businesses masquerading as doing good, but they bring together the best of both of those realms to really have impacts and to do it in ways that can be both profitable and changing for society and speaking to the issues that are arising.
So I like that you talked about loneliness in particular, because when I talked about framing a purpose as a meaningful challenge, as a starting point to work with companies, loneliness as a mental health challenge is actually one of the meaningful challenges that we've worked with a large Japanese multinational corporation at multiple levels, using that as the meaningful challenge. We've also looked at meaningful challenges as like financial inclusion, for example, in working with a large UK bank, and we'll be working with this huge demographic challenge that Korean companies are facing right now, because they have declining birth rates and a shrinking labor force. So I think I like the direction you're going. I'll just say that. I'll leave it there.
Thank you, Jay. Excellent presentation. I need a framework of your purpose and an example where the purpose has changed over a couple of periods of time.
Thank you very much for your presentation. My question is, you spoke about how you provide this shared value P&Ls with your in your presentation you mentioned. I was wondering what can happen in the venture capitalist domain so that they actually think on the values that you're saying, because I noticed that there is a huge gap between what you spoke and what actually investors are looking for. If you show them a return on impact, which I did in one of my pitch, basically they walked out of the room because it's not economically feasible. So what should change in the venture capitalist space? Thank you.
I'd like to know about metrics, please. How do you measure social, human, and management capital?
So the first question was about a company's purpose undergoing a change and it making a difference. I can't say that we helped this company do this, but we were inspired in some ways by this company. It's called Novo Nordisk, and it's the largest insulin manufacturer of the world. They went through an extraordinary purpose journey that changed the whole way in which the company operates and how it was perceived by its ecosystem of stakeholders, and supercharged its performance along the way. Basically, they had a purpose statement for many years that was very simple, and it was about selling more insulin. So it was basically selling insulin to make money from the symptoms of a dread disease. They underwent this epiphany, and they changed their purpose to a meaningful challenge at one point, and they changed it to solving diabetes. Counterintuitive for an insulin producer, because if you solve diabetes, you have no more insulin to sell to customers. But this one change dramatically changed the way that they operated and how they were perceived by their stakeholder ecosystem, who only wanted to work with Novo Nordisk and to buy their product, because this was so differentiating that Novo Nordisk was seen as being side by side with the stakeholders in trying to solve the underlying cause of the dread disease. So that's the example to answer that question. The investment question that you talked about, rather than just limit it to venture capitalists, I'll just expand it to the whole investment space. We actually have a private equity, a very successful private equity executive who's been the CEO of a couple of technology companies, who's taken over as the kind of overall leader of the economics of mutuality and its movement. His name is Gavin Long, and he became so infatuated with economics of mutuality that decided to join us, because he thought that you can use the principles of economics of mutuality and its practice to actually change the way fundamentally financial capital is deployed in investing, in all types of investing. And we have a methodology that we now applied to the first acquisition that we closed about 7 weeks ago, a company called Levanta, a mid-sized healthcare company, where we actually started in a very different way, in a very different place than investors start to think of. But that drove the whole process through. What we did was we created a capability to use AI and machine learning and big data analytics to look sector by sector and analyze all of the voices and what they were saying, the voices that mattered in each sector of the economy, starting with healthcare, and boil those down to what are this kind of 8 to 12 meaningful challenges that everybody seems to agree on that's reflected in all of this data. Once we had that, then we could go out and use a screening tool to look at all the M&A targets that were out there with the idea of what are the companies that are best positioned to address 3 or 4 of these meaningful challenges that we now know are the most critically important to all of the key voices in that sector of the economy. That narrowed it down to a number of companies that we could pursue, and then we could go from there. And then the last question was about metrics, and I guess very quickly I can say that we only have 13 metrics that we can use collectively to measure social, human, and natural capital. I mentioned trust, social cohesiveness, and the capacity to work collectively as the only 3 that really matter in a social capital space where there's over 100 metrics available. But those 3 always account for about 80% of whatever social capital space is there. Your human capital metrics we keep to 5, and they're usually entirely dependent upon the culture of the organization, and that culture attracts a certain kind of person that's interested in a certain type of value. At Mars, when we did this work, we discovered that because Mars focuses very much on its 5 principles, that the workforce, by and large, looked at do managers walk the talk of the values that they're espousing, and that actually equated roughly to a 30% pay increase that you might not have to give if you could actually satisfy the workforce that the managers actually meant it. Prospective upward mobility was another one of those metrics. And again, they were different, the 5 metrics for human capital, depending on the corporate culture. And lastly, we looked at input metrics for natural capital, and those were really 5 as well. And they were universal for the manufacture of anything, from a bag of rice to a Mars bar to a car. And those were ones, again, that I can share with you offline or direct you to our website, because I know I'm way out of time here.
Thank you so much, Dave. And thank you, Ben, for hosting us. Thank you, everybody, for being here. To be continued. Yeah, there is lots more to unpack and explore. So, Ben, maybe just one last word?
Well, I was, exposed to incredible work that Jay and Bob have been doing, and it's convinced me to move forward with this 5th track within human energy to really study and disseminate some of these wonderful lessons to help build the Noosphere in the best fashion possible.
Thank you. Thank you, everybody.
Thanks, everyone.